All right, brethren, this morning we're taking a bit of a deeper dive now into these theological arguments in Hebrews. If you remember, so last time I spoke on Hebrews, we did sort of a brief overview of the first 10 chapters of this book. And the reason, essentially, is because in those first 10 chapters, the author is giving us all this really deep and glorious theology about Jesus. And he's doing that in an attempt, as I explained, to help these Jewish Christians realize that what they have with Jesus is far better than anything they would have if they returned to Old Covenant Judaism. And I made the point to you that he makes this argument essentially by showing Jesus superior than all of those other things in 4 different ways. I don't know if you might remember those 4 ways. Does anybody remember the 4 ways that Jesus is shown to be superior, or even one of them? Superior as a son, right? That's the first one that he does. He shows Jesus superior as the unique Son of God, superior than the angels he deals with, and superior than Moses. Any other ones? Superior than the high priest. That's the second one. We're going in order here. This is good. We're doing well here. So he shows Jesus as a superior high priest. He's capable of really and completely dealing with our sin because he holds his high priesthood permanently, unlike the other high priests who would eventually die. How about another one? Any others? We're going in order. All right, this is perfect. So the next argument he makes is that Jesus is the mediator of a better covenant. Right? This is a covenant that God made with mankind, and it's better because it brings about the very promises that God had offered through the Old Testament. Now, what about the last one? Better sacrifice, right? So these 4 arguments, and this last one, this better sacrifice, he shows Jesus to be a sufficient sacrifice to actually deal with our sin, a sacrifice that doesn't need to be offered again. It's a once-for-all kind of sacrifice. And so we dealt with each of those 4 points kind of briefly. We didn't really go that in-depth into them, but I told you we were going to come back and we were going to deal with each of these individually because there's really just, there's too much. You can't deal with it all in one message. So this morning, our goal is going to be to look at the first argument he makes, which is showing Jesus superior as the unique Son of God and his position as the unique Son of God. And this really covers the first 4 chapters. So the first 4, he's laying out this point, trying to show Jesus superior than all others because of his position as the Son. Now, even within that argument, this is his first argument of the 4, and even within that argument, there is sort of a flow that takes place, okay? The first thing that he does, and this is really just the first 4 verses of chapter 1. The first thing he's going to do is just simply introduce this Son. We're told a few things about him, and the stage is really set for where he's going. This glorious Son has come, he has spoken, and he has done something marvelous for mankind in the purification of their sins. And this then drives him into this second thing, which is essentially going to be from chapter 1, verse 5, all the way through chapter 2, verse 4. And the second thing is to show this Son who has come and has spoken to be superior even to the angels, both in his nature, who he is, and in the message that he brings, which is a far superior message. The idea is this, brethren. The angels, who are God's messengers, he makes the point that these angels, as God's messengers, are to serve those who inherit salvation. But then this is contrasted with the Son, who brings the message of salvation and that very salvation itself. And the third thing he does in these chapters, which is essentially from chapter 2, verse 5 through chapter 3, verse 6, is he wants to show this Son as superior, as the founder of the salvation and redemption of God's people. Jesus is shown to have become like his brothers, like you and I, so that he could bring them salvation. And this is going to be shown to have been a necessary piece in the redemption that God was going to work. He is shown even to have been brought lower than the angels for a little while, so that he could take the position of his brethren, he could take their place as humanity, so that he could ultimately lead them back to redemption and glory. And eventually he's going to exalt Jesus as this Redeemer sent from God, who is even a greater Redeemer than Moses, who up to this point was really the greatest Redeemer of God's people. Now the last thing that he does is essentially application and exhortation based upon the things that he had just said concerning Jesus. And that is essentially from chapter 3, verse 7 through chapter 4, verse 13. And the point is essentially going to be this. If this is the very Son of God who has come, and if he has spoken to us, then we must take heed to what he has said. We must listen to him, obey him. And the constant refrain through that exhortation is, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. The call to these Jewish believers is to endure, so that they could enter the rest and the peace that God has offered for those who trust in the Messiah. But brethren, the rest and the peace that God offers is only for those who continue with their faith in God's Messiah and hold fast to their confidence in that Messiah, who's Jesus. And so the warning goes out to these believers. If you are led into unbelief, just like those people who came out of Egypt, who were redeemed by Moses out of Egypt, if you are led into unbelief, just like those people were in the days of Moses, you will be left out of God's promises and God's rest, just like those people were left out of God's rest and God's promised land in the days of Moses, because they were led away by unbelief. And so this is really where this whole argument is going from. And this is just the first part of what is happening in Hebrews. And so I want to go into each of these little elements of the argument in the first 4 chapters. And I want you to get this exalted view of who this Son is that is being portrayed to us through these first couple of chapters. So look with me at chapter 1. I'm going to read the first 4 verses. He says this: long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. Now, this is an introduction for the ages right here. Things are said here that are intended to put God's Son, who we'll find out later to be Jesus. He doesn't mention who it is necessarily right here. But these things are stated to put God's Son into an entirely different category than everything and everyone else. He is contrasted with literally every single person who has ever spoken for God. Every prophet, no matter how great they were in the eyes of the people, are immediately stated and shown to have been inferior to this Son who has come, right? He says, they have spoken before, but now, in these last days, something greater has happened. God has spoken by His Son. And of course, we get this imagery brought out in the New Testament text that Giovanni read for us at the Mount of Transfiguration. You get Jesus, He's there with Moses and Elijah, and these were the prophets of the prophets in the Old Testament, right? And the voice of the Father comes, and it says about Jesus, what does He say? This is whom? This is my beloved Son, right? With whom I am well pleased. And what does He say to do? Listen to Him. That is a very important point. What is happening in the story of redemption and what is happening in the unfolding of this plan of God, the Son shows up and He stands there with these pillars of the old covenant, prophets, men of God, and yet the Father comes and speaks to these disciples and He tells them, this is my Son. Listen to Him. And out of fear, the disciples fall, right? They fall down. And then when they look up, what do they see? Huh? They only see Jesus. Jesus is the only one that's left standing. Brethren, this is important. In the unfolding of God's plan, Jesus now stands as the supreme means of communication between God and man. And if we want to hear from God, we need to listen to Jesus. We need to listen to the Son of God. You remember, was it Philip maybe? At the end of Jesus' ministry, and he says, show us the Father, right? Does anybody remember if that's Philip? Huh? It is Philip? Is it John 15? You know then. Oh, okay. And he says, show us the Father, right? And what does Jesus respond to him? Do you know? Right. And he says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Brethren, if we want to know who God is, we need to do nothing other than to look to Jesus. He is the display of who God is. And He speaks for God perfectly. But not only is He exalted in these first couple verses here as the superior voice for God, but the author of Hebrews also says that this Son has been appointed the heir of all things, through whom also God created the world. Now, if we understand the Old Testament, this is not something that ought to take us by surprise. We ought to expect this type of language concerning the Son. Because under the Old Covenant law, the firstborn son had this right of inheritance. He had a place of preeminence above his brethren, and this son is no different. Remember, again, in the Old Testament text that Giovanni read, you have these statements made, right? God pronounces the king to be his son, and He tells him to ask for something. What does He tell him to ask for? You don't get to answer. You read it. Somebody else. What does He tell the Son to ask for in Psalm chapter 2? The nations. He tells him, Ask of me, and I will make the nations what? What are they to be for this son? Do you know what he says? His inheritance. It is an inheritance of nations. The nations, the world. The Son inherits this from the Father. Everything is His. In fact, in Hebrews, he puts it this way. He is the heir of all things. The inheritor of all things. All things that are the Father's are the Son's. But then He's also said to be the Creator. We're told in this introduction that this Son is the agent through whom God created the world. And there really can be no other explanation for that other than the fact that this Son of God is also God Himself. And that's exactly where He goes. In verse 3, He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of His nature. And brethren, not much more can possibly be said to introduce this Son in more of an exalted way. But this is the intent. The intent is to glorify Him so that others would view Him in the right way. And then he's not letting up here. He's going to continue to go down this path and now bring in these other sort of divine beings, these angels, these superior beings. He's going to bring them in and show that the Son holds an even more dignified position than even they hold. So he says at the end of verse 3 into verse 4 that the Son has sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to the angels as the name He has inherited is more excellent than theirs. This Son takes the most exalted position that there is. He is seated at the right hand of the God of the universe. Brethren, no angel has ever taken a seat next to the Father to reign with Him. That is not the position of any angel. That status and that position is the Son's and the Son's alone. Only He holds that position. And so the author then moves into this comparison between the Son and the angels. And what follows is essentially a number of quotations of the Old Testament concerning angels and concerning the Son of God. And these comparisons are made. They're contrasted with one another. Verse 5, a question is asked, to which of the angels did God ever say, "You are my Son, today I have begotten you"? And the answer is none. God never said that to any angel. Verse 6, when the Son does come into the world, what do the angels do? What are they called to do? Worship. Let all God's angels worship Him, this Son. Verse 13, another question is asked. To which of the angels did God ever say, "Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool"? And again, the answer is none of them. God has never spoken that way in regards to the angels. And so the point is made quite clear in verse 14. The angels are ministering spirits sent out to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation. Brethren, the contrast is made clearly for us to see. The angels are not the inheritors of all things, as the Son is. The angels are not creators, as the Son is. The angels do not have the exalted position that the Son has. The angels are not workers of salvation, as the Son is, but rather they were created by the Son to serve those who were to inherit, who were to receive salvation. They do have a role to play in God's redemption, but not the same role that the Son has. And so, what then is the conclusion that he comes to in this exaltation of the Son? He says in chapter 2, verse 1, "Therefore, we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it." The people who have heard the words of the Son of God have a duty to give proper attention to it. To hear the Son of God, to hear the words of the Son of God, and to disregard those words is going to result in severe, severe judgment. Notice why in verses 2 and 3 of chapter 2. He says, "For since the message declared by angels proved to be reliable, and every transgression or disobedience received a just retribution, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation?" What does he speak of here? What do you think he speaks of when he says the message declared by angels? What message is that? Any thoughts? What is the context? What is he's speaking here of a message declared by angels, and he says, every transgression or disobedience received a just retribution. What does that sound like? Sounds like the law, doesn't it? Right? Now, it's interesting because when we think of the law as given at Mount Sinai, we don't really think of, oh, this was delivered by angels, right? We think of, oh, Moses went up there and he brought down this law to the people. But it is interesting that I do think what he speaks here is of the law, and it being given at Mount Sinai. And the reason is because throughout the Bible, there actually is a lot of talk of the angels as the means by which this message, this law came to Moses and thereby came to the people. Listen to just a few of these. You find it in Deuteronomy 33. Moses is, I'll give you these texts later if you want, but Moses recounts, in Deuteronomy 33, he recounts what happened there at Sinai. And he says this, that Yahweh came from Sinai. He says, he came from the 10,000s of his holy ones with flaming fire at his right hand. Now that is a clear reference all throughout the Old Testament to angelic beings, right? These are the holy ones of God in flaming fire. And then in Acts chapter 7, Stephen, as he's sort of preaching there to these Jewish leaders, he says this, that you received the law which was delivered by angels and have not kept it. And then Paul, he speaks of this also in Galatians chapter 3. He says that the law was put in place through angels as an intermediary. And so through these angels, as God's messengers, this law comes, this message comes. And that law, if it was not obeyed, came with major repercussions. Right? He says that every transgression or disobedience received a just retribution. And here's the driving point. If that was the case with a message that was delivered by angels, how much worse will the punishment be for those who reject the message that is brought not by angels, but by God's very own Son? Because this is exactly what he says. He says, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? And then he says, it was declared at first by whom? The Lord. It was declared at first by the Lord. and it was attested to us by those who heard. This message comes by God's very own Son. The angels didn't bring this message. The Son brought this message. And so the point is raised. If there was such punishment brought upon people who disregarded the message brought by angels, what will happen to those who disregard the message brought by God's very own Son? And brethren, you have to think here there's parables of this kind of thing throughout the Gospels. Jesus gives us a parable of the tenants, right, and this vineyard. And here you have this master. He plants a vineyard. And he leases it out to these tenants, people who are going to care for this vineyard. And the time comes for him to finally collect on his vineyard. So he sends some messengers. He sends some servants out. And what do the tenants do to those servants? They beat them. They kill some of them, right? And then he sends another group. Well, go again, right? And so these other messengers, these other servants go out. And what do the tenants do to them? Same thing. They beat some, they kill some, right? And then what does the owner of the vineyard do? He says, I will send my son, right? And what does he think they will do? They will respect my son, right? So he sends the son out, and what happens? They kill him. They throw him out of the vineyard, and they kill him. And Jesus asks a question. When, therefore, the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do with those tenants? And it's shocking. The people provide an answer. The people to whom Jesus is preaching provide an answer. You know what that answer is? He will put those wretches to a miserable death and let out the vineyard to other tenants who will give their fruits in their season. And this is exactly what is being portrayed for us in this section of Hebrews. If the Son and his message are disregarded, God will spare no punishment. He will put all who reject his Son to a miserable death. And so once again, the question is put to these people. How shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? And again, you might think, why would they neglect it? I mean, it's just, salvation is glorious. But you have to understand, again, these are people who had made a confession in the Messiah and are being tempted to return back to Old Covenant Judaism because of everything that was happening around them. And he says to them, do not neglect this salvation brought by the Son. God will not take it lightly. Now, the next section, chapter 2, verse 5 through chapter 3, verse 6, the author is going to use everything that he has just said in an attempt to exalt the Son to this height of glorified existence. And he's going to use that to make a point about this salvation and this redemption that he has brought. The redemption and glory brought on by the Son. Brethren, it comes in an unexpected way. It doesn't come as we might think. It came through death and suffering and humiliation. But through this act, the unique Son of God actually brings many others into the family of God, many other sons and daughters. He brings many other sons and daughters to glory with him. And the point is going to be, essentially, that He, the Son, this glorified, exalted Son, He became like us so that we could ultimately become like Him. Now, this redemption fundamentally begins really at creation. And so this is where our author sort of steps back now in the time of everything and steps back into creation. And look at what he says in verse 5. He says, "For it was not to angels that God subjected the world to come, of which we are speaking." Now, before I enter into this, I just want to say the argument that is laid out here is complicated. I'm hoping that by the end it will be clear, but it is complicated. And there is some really intricate theology that is taking place in this next section. And so I would ask you to don't lose me here, all right? Focus and track where he is going with this. And I'm going to try to make it as clear as I can possibly make it. But this is going to be the point that is developed in the next several verses. That the world was supposed to be subjected to and taken dominion by man. By mankind, if you will. But of course, there was a great failure. The sin of man and the fall of man, this ideal was not reached. Mankind did not do what he was supposed to do. He sinned and failed and fell short of what he was supposed to do. And so for this intended end of mankind to be reached, we were going to need a complete and total redemption and restoration. And this is going to be the argument of what's taking place here in this section. And so he tells us in verse 5 that the world, which he says, we've already been speaking about this world. This is the world that in chapter 1 we're told was created by the Son, right? So he says this world which was created by the Son, this world that you live in, was not subjected to angels. As great as those angelic beings are and were, the reality is, brethren, that mankind was given the role as God's co-ruler over the earth. That's who we were supposed to be. God had put mankind as the ruler of earth. And this world was placed not in subjection to the angels, but in subjection to man. And he was called by God to take dominion over it. And he's going to quote from Psalm chapter 8, which he is now going to use as sort of the basis of his argument going forward. And I want you to go back to Psalm chapter 8, because I want you to see the language there, and then we're going to come back to Hebrews and see how he uses it. Psalm 8, we're just going to read the whole thing. He says, "O Yahweh our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouth of babies and infants you have established strength because of your foes, to still the enemy and the avenger. When I look to your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place." Now, take special notice here of the next couple of verses, because this is what's quoted in Hebrews. He says, "What is man that you are mindful of him? And the Son of Man that you care for him? Yet you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings, and crowned him with glory and honor. You have given him dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, and the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the sea. O Yahweh our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. Now, go back over to Hebrews. Because when we come back to this section, you have essentially the same text, but there is a slight change in the translation. The ESV has a slight change. Not every translation has a slight change, but I want you to see where it is. In verse 7 of chapter 2, the ESV translates, remember the original phrase in Psalm chapter 8 was that you have made him, man, a little lower than the angels. And the idea is in terms of position, that mankind was made a little lower than the angels, but was given superiority over the earth. The earth was subjected to man. But notice the change in verse 7 of chapter 2 of Hebrews. It says, you have made him for a little while lower than the angels. Now, I don't have a ton of time to get into this, and I'm not even really going to at this point. But that particular change is not made by every translation. In fact, it's not made by most translations. And I don't think that the change is necessary. I think that the change in the wording is often put that way because of a certain take of interpretation on what is happening in the passage. And I can understand that particular take of interpretation, but I think it does actually lose sight of what's actually happening in the text. And so let me just say this. I think that the quotation ought to read the same way it reads in Psalm chapter 8. The language is ambiguous, and so you could take it to read, you made him for a little while lower than the angels, or you could take it to read, you have made him a little lower than the angels, and have it read exactly like it reads in Psalm chapter 8. And the reason I think it needs to read the same way is because the argument that the author is going to make for us is that he is wanting to show that mankind was supposed to be this way. They were supposed to take dominion over all things, but we failed. And so what we need is this Son of God who would come and bring redemption and actually bring us to this position that was the intended position of mankind. So here's how he's going to build this argument, all right? He quotes from Psalm 8 to show that the world was indeed supposed to be subjected to man. That's how God intended things to be. He says, you have crowned him, mankind, with glory and honor, putting everything in subjection under his feet. And then he's going to continue this thought in verse 8. Look at, he's in the second part of verse 8. He says, now in putting everything in subjection to him. I want you to understand here, brethren, the idea is still what is the ideal situation for man. He says, in putting everything in subjection to him, mankind, he left nothing outside of his control. The point here is still in regards to humanity, to man. And then he is going to state the problem in the last part of verse 8. This is the issue. He says, at present, we do not yet see everything in subjection to him. That again, the idea again here is mankind. We don't see this as what has taken place because of the sin and corruption and fall of mankind. That's where they were supposed to be, and yet we're not seeing it as a reality. So he states this problem. And brethren, this is so important for you to get in the development of what he's doing here to show in this redemption. Mankind was supposed to be a ruler. He was supposed to take dominion in a God-glorifying way. And the issue is, that's not what happened. They failed. They fell into sin and corruption. And so the author is going to begin to now shift into what happened? What's the solution? How does this get fixed? How does man get returned back to what he was supposed to be? And so he shifts here into this salvation and redemption of man, and he's going to do so by using the same psalm that he had already been using, and he's going to do a little play on the words here in this psalm to help us see how Jesus now enters in to the redemption of mankind, to bring mankind to their glorified, intended state. And so he says in 8 and 9 that we do not see everything in subjection to him, mankind. But then he says in verse 9, but we do see him who for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus. And now he's bringing in this other him who has come in to redeem the other him, mankind, who has fallen into sin. He has come to redeem God's people. And brethren, you have to track here with this. The idea is that man has failed in the role that he was given. And so another man has come who could bring the first man back to his intended state. And so the issue, the problem that we have as mankind is that we don't see him, mankind, as having taken dominion, but we do see him, a new man who stands in our place, namely Jesus, who was made for a little while lower than the angels. And again, this is a key point, brethren, because you have to remember, back in Psalm chapter 8, it speaks of all things of earth subjected to man. But there is one thing that is not in that psalm subjected to man. But rather, man is subjected to this one thing. Do you remember what it said in Psalm chapter 8? You have made him a little lower than what? Huh? Someone said it? Angels. The psalmist says heavenly beings, but the idea is nevertheless the same. That you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings, a little lower than the angels. And then he's given dominion over the earth, right? So mankind actually had this subordinate role to these divine beings. And here's this play on the words that's happening in Hebrews. Mankind was made a little lower than the angels. And for this other man to come and redeem mankind, he would have to take their place. And so he says that this Jesus was made lower than the angels. But here's the change in what takes place, right? He's made lower than the angels for a little while. And brethren, this is an incredibly shocking statement. Because what did we just hear all through chapter 1 and the first half of chapter 2 about this son? What position does he take? What position does he hold? He holds an exalted position. He doesn't hold a position lower than the angels. He holds an exalted place. This Son, all through chapter 1 and the first half of chapter 2, is exalted far above the angels. He's been placed, brethren, in an entirely different category than the angels. He's much superior to them. And yet now, as we see this story of redemption unfolding, we see him take a place that's lower than the angels. Brethren, that is not the Son's position by design. The Son is not supposed to be in that position, but he took that position. He took that position as a choice. He humbled himself, and he placed himself in the same position of those whom he came to redeem. He became like them in their state, again, with the intended goal to bring them with him back to his glorified state, the intended state of man. And we see this sort of develop in the argumentation. Look at how this kind of flows. You see it in verse 9. He says, we see him, Jesus, who for a little while was made lower than the angels, now crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death. He took a place of humility, and now, through suffering, receives back his rightful glory and honor. And he goes on in verse 10. It was fitting that he, this is God, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. Brethren, this was the fitting way for God to fix humanity and to fix their problem. We have this new man who now stands in the place of fallen man so that he could bring about their salvation and their redemption. And he does it through suffering. And in doing so, brethren, he brings many others with him to glory, this ideal state of man, God's intended state of man. But it required this Son to take this very humbled position. And this is the point that continues to come out through the following argumentation, this necessity of this humbled position of the Son. Verse 14, since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things. Verse 17, therefore he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest. The entire driving point, brethren, from chapter 2, verse 5, is explaining the means that God used to get man to his intended end. And it was a redemption. Because of sin and because of the fall, mankind required a complete redemption and restoration and salvation. Man had initially been given this role as God's co-ruler over the earth, but he had failed to occupy this intended position of sovereignty. And so the author, he quotes from this psalm, Psalm 8, with the intent of showing us that this still needs fulfillment. This needs fulfillment. And the fulfillment, according to what is told us here in Hebrews, comes through another man. And this man became like us, even to the degree that he placed himself below these angelic beings, which he once held such superiority over. And he did it so that he could suffer and that he could die, so that he could then be crowned with glory and honor. This Jesus, brethren, through the incarnation, takes mankind's position as it's represented there in Psalm 8, and he works redemption for them. He brings them back to where God intended them to be. Jesus attains man's appointed end, but not even really for himself. He does it so that he could bring many other sons and daughters with him to glory. Brethren, through the Son's humility, we are brought to glory. And so this drives then this final comparison between Jesus and Moses. We're called in chapter 3, verse 1, to consider Jesus, who was faithful to the one who appointed him. Jesus performs this act of redemption which far surpasses all other acts of redemption, even when Moses redeemed Israel out of Egypt. In Acts chapter 7, Stephen speaks of Moses, and he says that this man, Moses, God sent as both a ruler and redeemer. And brethren, we're shown in Hebrews that Jesus is a far superior ruler and redeemer. He tells us that Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses. And brethren, the reason is because this Jesus, this Messiah, this Son of God has actually worked a greater redemption, a complete redemption of God's people. But there is a caveat. He says here in chapter 3, verse 6, "But Christ is faithful over God's house as a son, and we are his house, if indeed we hold fast our confidence and our boasting in our hope." Well, then there's a caveat. To hold fast to Christ. And this really then brings about the exhortation that carries us all the way to chapter 4, verse 13. And we're not going to really look at it in depth, but I want you to just understand a few things said in this. As he now the author here makes application himself of the things that he has just said concerning Jesus. He makes his own application for us. As I said before, the continued refrain through this exhortation is, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart. And it comes in chapter 3, verse 8, it comes in chapter 3, verse 15, and it comes in chapter 4, verse 7. 3 times through this section, that continued point is made. Do not harden your heart. Given the fact that this Son of God has come and has spoken, brethren, we must not presume that if people disregard this message, that the Father will take it lightly. He will not. And so we're pressed to listen to the Son. His message is the message that we desperately need, this message of redemption. And furthermore, we are exhorted to hold our confidence in the Messiah. Listen to the warning in chapter 3, verse 12. He says, "Take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God." Brethren, this is the temptation that was being faced by these people, to be led away into an unbelieving heart. And brethren, unbelief will not result in the blessing of God. Look at verse 14. "For we have come to share in Christ, if indeed we hold our original confidence firm to the end." Brethren, it does these Jewish believers, these Christians, And it does us no good to say that we believed in the Messiah before, only to have walked away from him at some other point. You cannot walk away from God's Redeemer and God's Savior and expect to receive salvation. He goes on in the following paragraph and a half or so, and he speaks about those people who left Egypt with Moses. These are the people who were redeemed by the hand of God through Moses. And the thought might be, well, those people were redeemed by God. Surely they were faithful and they received everything that God had promised for them. But that's not the truth. That's not the reality of what happened. Those very people who were redeemed were the very ones who rebelled against God. And God punished them. They did not receive the promises that God had made because they went in unbelief. God punished the very people that he had redeemed out of slavery. Look at verse 19. He says, we see that they, speaking of those Israelites who had come out of Egypt with Moses, they were unable to enter. And he's talking about here entering God's promised land, God's promised rest, the promises that God had for Israel. These people were unable to enter, even though they had come out of slavery in Egypt and they were redeemed by God through the hand of Moses. They were unable to enter the promises because of unbelief. The whole point, brethren, is that hearing the good news of redemption does you no good if you are not joined to it by faith. And this is actually the very point made. Look at chapter 4, verse 2. He says, for good news came to us just as to them. Again, he's speaking of these same people, these Israelites, right? Good news came to us just as it came to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them. Why? How did it not benefit them? Because they were not united by faith with those who listened. And so he pleads with these people to heed the words of the Son of God, to not fall away by unbelief. Brethren, there is a place of rest and a place of peace which is ours to have. A redemption that is offered by God through the Son, which is ours to have if we are willing to have it by faith. And he calls to these people, chapter 4, verse 1, he says, therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. And again, in chapter 4, verse 11, let us therefore strive to enter that rest, so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience. And brethren, my call to you is the same as our author's call to these believers. To press on. To not forfeit your confidence in God's Son, in the Messiah. Brethren, the enemy wants to instill unbelief. And he will do it by whatever means possible to lead us away from God. But brethren, don't go that way. Don't go that way. Don't abandon Christ. Don't abandon God's Redeemer. Don't be the one who fails to enter because of unbelief. Brethren, you have to remember constantly these words of Jesus in John 14:1. Do you know this? What does it say? That's right. Jesus says, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. And this is the call throughout Hebrews. Believe in the Son. Believe in the redemption that He has brought for His people. Listen to Him. He has come and He has spoken a great word of redemption, and He's actually accomplished that redemption. Brethren, He has brought us from destruction to glory. He's brought us with Him. Jesus did not come to do a bunch of stuff and then just leave us in the same place we were in. Brethren, He brings us with Him to glory. Brethren, this Son, the Lord Jesus, is worthy of our devotion. And we have come to share in Him and with Him and all that He has to offer us if we hold firm our confidence in Him. So, brethren, remain. Hold firm to that Son. Let's pray.